These seminars are intended to bring prominent economists and chief economists from international organizations. And I couldn't be happier to host Jason for our first or resumption of our first chief economist talk, because not only is a prominent economist, but also he was the chair of the EPC, not only the CA, but also the EPC for several years, and is one of the most influential economists in the world. So it's a great pleasure that we bring Jason to talk among friends, and bringing him home, or another home that he has around the international organizations. Jason is the professor of practice of economic policy jointly at Harvard Kennedy School and the Department of Economics at Harvard University. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He engages in a lot of public policy debates through research, writing, and teaching in several areas, including the United States and international macroeconomics, fiscal policy, labor markets, and competition policy. He's also teaching the largest course at Harvard University, Principles of Economics. And so students will start in a good way with Jason, I'm sure. But he, as I said previously, he served 8 years as top economic advisor to President Obama, including serving as the 28th chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And that's when he was also chair of EPC. Jason is also a member of numerous organizations, including the Council on Foreign Relations, the Group of 30, and the Economic Strategy Group, and many other collaborations. He has written very important and highly cited journals, regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal and Project Syndicate, and an editor of 2 books on economic policy. And with that, we are very happy to welcome you back, Jason. So please go ahead.
It's great to be back here. I was first at the OECD in the 1990s when I was on the staff of the Council of Economic Advisors, and I staffed the chair when it was Joe Stiglitz and then Janet Yellen, and they were chairing the EPC. I had the chance to lead a delegation to the WP1 back then when the person who was supposed to lead it wasn't able to. At the time, the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury thought I was way too junior to lead that delegation. And so Larry Summers pulled the senior Treasury people that were going to be on the delegation because he thought it was insulting to them to have to travel here with me. We've gotten over that problem. And so then I was really excited when I joined the government, got to chair the EPC and spend about 3.5 years doing that, and continue to be a fan and consumer of what all of you do. And so was happy when Alvaro invited me back here. I have a lot of thoughts on a lot of topics, and I'm happy to talk about any of them with you, including the macro outlook, why inflation came, has it gone, the US fiscal situation, what's going to happen next in the United States, productivity in Europe, etc. But what I wanted to do before that was just rant and rave a little bit to a captive audience. And the title of the ranting and raving was, Rethinking Economics or Thinking Economics. The motivation of that is there's just an increased drumbeat of calls to rethink economics. Some of those calls to rethink economics come from outside the House. I think of the prototypical column in The Guardian as saying something to the effect of, no economist has ever studied inequality, considered climate change, or taken into account that people might not behave in a rational homo economicus way. We need to build a new economics that looks at all of those things. And that's easy enough to dismiss because we all know economics actually does study all those topics, does take behavioral economics seriously, is not this type of free market caricature. But the criticism is also increasingly coming from inside the House. Angus Deaton is probably the most important and most notable person who has wrote a book about 8 years ago called The Great Escape, about globalization, immigration, and the enormous changes for the positive, and now has done a 180 and is quite skeptical of the problems that have, in his view, have been brought by globalization and trade. Thinks economists have been insensitive to that and need to build a new set of questions that people are concerned with and a new set of answers. And I think that does deserve to be taken seriously. And then finally, there's a set of people who are neither outside the house nor inside the house, but are trying to build a house right next door, or maybe adjacent. In a backward-looking sense in the United States, there's broadly 4 schools of thought that have emerged in different ways to challenge orthodox economics. One is modern monetary theory, and the idea that there aren't real fiscal constraints, or maybe the fiscal constraint is inflation, but by the way, you can deal with inflation with price controls or something, so there isn't actually any constraint on fiscal policy. A second would be a neo-Brandeisian approach to antitrust, which says rather than weigh whether big things are good or big things are bad, because they have a set of efficiencies, but they also have a set of market power, and you need a technocratic analysis to decide between the two, that big is presumptively bad. And maybe it's bad for classic economic reasons, but also you want to go beyond the consumer welfare standard and think of what big means for democracy, for small businesses, for media diversity, privacy, et cetera, et cetera. The third approach doesn't really quite have a name, but it's price controls. And it's Isabella Weber out there arguing that there's alternative ways to control inflation, alternative tools that can avoid the unpleasant choices that you'd have through monetary policy. And the fourth one is industrial policy. And I want to be careful about that because there's lots of different variants and versions of industrial policy. But this would be the claim that industrial policy isn't just a way to advance a particular goal like national security, but is also an economic strategy to create more jobs at better wages and should be done in a holistic way so that you include labor unions and childcare and climate change and all of that together in one integrated approach. These 4 are a little bit on my mind because they've all, to some degree or other, had an influence over US economic policy over the last 4 years. And in some cases, I think relatively modest influence. In some cases, a relatively large one. Going forward, though, there's a 5th one, which isn't quite building a house, but there's at least one person that's erected a tent, and that's protectionism, populism, and the like. The tent was erected by, I would say, Oren Cass of something called the American Compass Project, is the best attempt to make something coherent out of a set of often incoherent and incoherent impulses, and to put some policy rationale underlying all of it. And I think we're quite familiar with that, but this is a reaction to trade, to immigration, a belief that the world is zero-sum, a belief that the United States, at least in the United States, is taken advantage of by other countries and need to rectify that. So all of these rethinkings of economics are happening, and it's not that they're all bad, but they all have, I think, a few things in common. One is a belief that economists have ruled economic policy for the last many decades, that the things that we don't like, whether it's big corporations, increase in inequality, slowdown in middle-class income growth, whatever it is, runaway climate change, overdependence on China, whatever it is, that somehow was because people listened to economists and were taking their advice and constructed some type of world in their image. The second thing these have in common is a belief that economic worldview can be called neoliberalism, whatever that is. And that neoliberalism is, first of all, unambitious because it's overly afraid of trade-offs. It's overly focused on budget constraints and doesn't want to do big things. and that it's inattentive to these other issues like climate change and inequality, and that it fetishizes markets as a solution over government playing a more muscular role. And finally, they all think that some alternative, which you could call post-neoliberalism, and there's different directions you could go with post-neoliberalism, is both better policy, but also better politics. That it's grounded in certain groups in society, that it emphasizes the intersectionality of different policy areas. Instead of being trade-offs, you can address inequality, climate change, national security, and middle-class jobs together, and largely do that by eschewing trade-offs and even eschewing and avoiding a certain amount of the traditional analysis. So where did all of this come from? Part of it came from the financial crisis, which I think it's fair to say economists didn't see coming. Whether that's a failure of economics or financial crises are like a roll of the dice and they're not forecastable, I'm not sure. Stock prices, for example, are not forecastable. That's not a failure of economics. In fact, economics can explain to you precisely why stock prices are not forecastable. Could you make the same argument for financial crises? I'm less sure, but it's possible. And that's what gave rise here at the OECD to NAIC and the NAIC process. Then there's the China shock, the rise of inequality, and the rise of populism around the world, whether it's Donald Trump in the United States or Donald Trump in the United States, Brexit, and the many other examples of rising populism in European countries, for example, and the idea that we needed a better response to this. I think some of this challenge is good and healthy and is an important reminder and warning to people that do something more resembling traditional economics. But I think a lot of it is mistaken. I think it's mistaken for 6 reasons. The first is economics is not static. If you pick up an economics journal, it's constantly rethinking economics. You do not get rewarded as an economist for writing the same paper over and over again. You get rewarded for making new ideas. So for example, monopsony in labor markets is something that has been of increased interest to academic economists. Alvaro told me that you're all doing work on non-competes agreements, and that's something that came out of academia. Probably wasn't that attentive to it 15 years ago, got more attentive to it, started thinking about labor market through lenses other than the competitive model. And you see policy organizations like the OECD doing it as well. So this target of all of this criticism itself actually incorporates a lot of these ideas. Second, economics really does reflect multiple goals. And it is not just about dollars. It's not just about growth, but it can be about climate change, inequality, national security, poverty, health, life expectancy, happiness. And your work at the OECD on multidimensional aspects of living standards is one very good example of that. Third, markets are incredibly powerful. The way in which they harness incentives, organize information, include mechanisms to self-correct is just something that is very, very hard to rival the power of, even if markets by themselves are not always directed in the right way, figuring out how to harness them. Fourth, maybe I'm overly defensive on this, but I think an awful lot of problems come from not listening to economists, not from overly listening to them. In the United States, in the wake of the financial crisis, the predominant view on the economic team was we needed a very, very large fiscal stimulus, and politicians were scared by the price tag. The American people were concerned about the deficit in 2009, 10, and 11 at a time when I think it made no sense at all to be concerned about deficit, and economists didn't think so. And so that stimulus was too small, in part from not listening to economists. And then in 2021, I think the fiscal stimulus in the United States was too big. Again, economists had measures of how big it should be, and those were largely ignored for political reasons. The advice we were getting in the wake of the financial crisis, some of it from the OECD, I think frankly more forcefully from the IMF, was to avoid a fiscal contraction, to make sure to do more upfront fiscal support for an economy that still had a high unemployment rate. And international organizations, the OECD, the IMF, as well as economists, were quick to recognize that in a world of low interest rates, you should think about fiscal policy and fiscal sustainability differently than you would elsewhere. Carbon tax is another one I'd put in this category. I once read a very strong criticism from Stiglitz and Stern of Bill Nordhaus, saying his discount rate was too high, his carbon tax was too low, and that's the reason we had climate change. This was at a time when Nordhaus was advocating something like an $80 a ton carbon tax, and Stiglitz and Stern thought it should be maybe $200 a ton. My view watching that debate was the United States was currently at $0 a ton. We now have a set of policies that are equivalent of about $8 a ton. So if we listened to Nordhaus and got to 80, by all means, criticize away, talk about how terrible it was that people listened to Nordhaus and they stopped at 80. But if you're at 0 or 8, and one person wants 80 and the other person wants 200, I think the 80 and 200 people have a lot more in common with each other, and neither of them is being listened to. Fifth, economists are sometimes listened to, and I've actually developed more fondness for the orthodox economic approach over the last several years. Maybe it's watching inflation and seeing that, watching the lack of financial crises in emerging markets in the wake of an incredibly disruptive pandemic. To be clear, there are places like Turkey and Argentina and Sri Lanka, but they more prove the point I'm going to make rather than disprove it. The orthodox approach has had a number of successes. Carbon taxes actually have spread. More and more parts of the world are doing them, and more and parts of the world, like Europe, have wrapped up the ambition of them. Central bank independence with inflation targeting didn't keep us from getting inflation, but it helped contain inflation expectations, and bring it down at a much lower cost than it ever had been brought down with before. I think approaches to antitrust have improved over time from the big is bad approach in the past. And finally, more orthodox views for emerging markets of have more floating exchange rates, don't borrow too much in short-term foreign denominated debt, build up a decent amount of reserves, I think are why most countries in the most disruptive event they've had in decades survived it quite well. And to some degree, I think of orthodoxy as maybe getting countries to the 85th percentile of how good they can be. If you then innovate and do some clever, smart things, you can get yourself to the 100th percentile. But if you mess them up, you can get yourself to as low as the 0th percentile. And so, yes, it's not the perfect answer, but it's a decently robust one. And then finally, I think a number of the alternative approaches have been flawed in a number of ways, and I can talk a little bit about it now or more later. Underlying a lot of these flaws, though, I think are two different types of vices that you see. One I've called the liberal vice. And this is overly caricaturing. This is liberal in the American sense, which is left. And that's the idea that all good things go together. Whatever you do to tackle climate change, whatever you do to tackle monopolies, whatever you do to reduce inequality, whatever it is, that's going to help economic growth also. And all good things go together. Now, there are some good things that go together, absolutely. But if you think all good things go together, you run into one of three problems. One is, if you do the analysis right, you rule out a lot of things that you should be doing. If there's a way to tackle climate change that costs $5 a ton hurts GDP by a minuscule amount, but reduces emissions by a lot, you should do that. And if you're doing the analysis correctly about all good things go together, you'd rule that out. Second is, I think you end up often doing the analysis wrong and thinking all good things go together when they don't. And that means you can end up actually going too far and doing things that are inefficient, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then finally, the world probably, a lot of your policies actually aren't Pareto improvements. And the groups that aren't Pareto improved might notice when they're not Pareto improved by whatever policy it is you're attached to. And if you fool yourself into thinking it's good for everyone, the people who it's not good for are going to figure out it's not good for them and try to stop it. And so your good intentions may not actually come to fruition. So that's a liberal vice of all good things go together. On the other side, the conservative vice, again, caricaturing, exaggerating, is that whatever it is you're doing, the cost of it is like infinity. You do a really minor regulation for climate change, it's going to destroy economic growth. It's going to destroy your economy. The tiniest thing on poverty inequality, huge negative impact on growth. So roughly thinking, I think the liberals get the sign wrong. You know, minimum wage, like good for the economy and good for wages. Conservatives get the magnitude wrong. Minimum wage, massive impact on employment. And what they have in common is that liberals end up doing benefit-benefit analysis, and everything passes that test. And conservatives, once the costs are so large, do cost analysis, and nothing passes that test. And neither liberals nor conservatives, again, gross caricature, tons of people don't fall into these, neither one of them needs to actually do analysis, because if it's benefit-benefit, no matter how you do the numbers, it's going to pass. And if it's cost without any benefit, it's going to fail. And so the analysis becomes propaganda for your idea to convince people, hey, look how big the benefits are, let's do it. Or look how horrible the costs are, let's not do it, rather than what analysis should be, which is figuring out what you should and shouldn't do. I will quickly talk about 4 areas to just illustrate where I think these different methodologies and approaches differ. First was COVID and lockdowns and other policies. At first, I was of the view that lockdowns were good for the economy because they stopped the spread of the virus and they were an investment. Within a few months, it became pretty clear that lockdowns were good for saving lives and bad for the economy, because it wasn't like you made a one-time investment and then you never had COVID, or that you could even have a tenable bridge to a vaccine. And so then you're doing not benefit-benefit analysis like the liberals who said, oh, the more the lockdowns are, the better it is for the economy. You don't want to do the conservative analysis of, oh, these lockdowns are destroying growth. You want to start asking, you have lives versus economy, and we have tools to weigh the two of those. And my guess is that if you did the cost-benefit analysis correctly, that bars and restaurants indoors should have been shut down through all of 2020. That would pass a cost-benefit test. Shutting down outdoor construction sites would not pass a cost-benefit test. And that's what you have to do almost on a case-by-case basis. And I should say, in the United States, we saw that as the red states, the conservative states, dropped their lockdowns earlier than blue states did, the red states had faster economic growth and faster job growth. That doesn't justify what they did. They might have cost too many lives and the consequence of doing that, but it does say there was a trade-off. Second, climate change. There are some no regrets win-win policies there, things like nudges and greater energy efficiency and the like. I think they're mostly on the small side. They're mostly not particularly scalable. I think some of them, the results fade over time and might be overstated by the research we have. So most of what we have is a trade-off. And some things, as I read the evidence, wind and solar subsidies that we've done in the United States are maybe a $30 to $80 per ton cost for reducing carbon emissions. That's below my social cost of carbon, so passes a cost-benefit test. Subsidies for electric vehicles, maybe more like $1,000 to $1,500 per ton of carbon reduced. That doesn't pass a cost benefit test for me. And so you have to start thinking about it. And by the way, a carbon tax, you don't even really need to do the analysis because you know everything with a cost below your carbon tax gets mitigated, and everything with a cost above it doesn't get mitigated. You don't need to decide what those things are. Third, industrial policy. You ask me to come up with a way to help the middle class in America, and I could rank my ideas from 1 to 1,000. Idea 1001 would be to give $8.5 billion to Intel. That's just not a great way to help the middle class in the United States. They employ highly skilled workers. They don't employ that many workers. A bunch of it goes to profits, etc. This is not a great economic strategy. But I think it is a very defensible and probably good national security strategy. We get 90% of our advanced microchips from one island that is in a very vulnerable geopolitical position. I think the United States should make more of them. I don't think we're going to make them as well as Taiwan does. I don't think it's an economically efficient thing to do, but I think it's worth paying a cost and paying more for microchips made in the United States in order to have that resilience. But that's a cost-benefit analysis. How much more are we paying for the microchips? How much more national security are we getting? I think on solar panels, when I do that type of cost-benefit test, it doesn't, restrictions on solar imports do not pass that test. EVs, I think they don't pass it, but I'm not sure. But all of these industrial policies are in some sense costly. You could have used the money for something else. If you borrow the money or it stimulates additional investment, interest rates go up, mortgage rates go up, and so you get less housing, you get more factory construction, you subsidize, less factory construction, you don't. The costs are borne by a large swath of society, and you're asking people to pay for something. Is it worth it, what you're asking them to pay for? I think it's worth it when the United States builds an aircraft carrier, and I think it's probably worth it when we subsidize microchips, but both of those we should think of, they are a cost that you're incurring, not some magical economic strategy that is a benefit. And I would note in some areas people get this right. No one says sanctions on Russia are an amazing way to build great middle-class jobs in the United States. No one would make that argument. We recognize that you're paying a small cost in exchange for a national security benefit. I think any decoupling from China is of a similar nature. You're asking Americans to pay a cost and generalize any country that does it. And the question is it worth the benefits? Last one that would be in this category is fiscal transfers. If you do something, and I have a little bit of a bee in my bonnet about this, so indulge me for a second. We did student loan relief in the United States, about $500 billion of it. It was done without Congress. It largely goes to upper middle class people. Upper middle class people need money too. And if you give me an up or down vote on like, should we, all else equal, make people who, make $100,000 a year and graduated from law school a bit better off? Sure, it's like expensive to live in New York, even on a law firm salary. I'm sure those people, some of them have children, a lot of them are nice. Why not give them the money? Well, that's the benefit analysis. And if you look at some of the analysis that came out of this administration, they said, oh, these people won't be indebted, so they'll start more businesses and they'll buy more homes and they'll create more jobs, and it'll be good for everyone if you do it. That's just sort of errant and total nonsense. What you get when you do this is a bit more consumption, so a bit more inflation and a demand-constrained economy. I estimated that every household would pay, maybe $25 or $30 of reduced consumption power in exchange for this. You get higher interest rates, and you get in the future either higher taxes or lower spending in order to pay for it. Now, that doesn't say this is a good or a bad idea. If you, for example, did tax credits for poor children, even though it would have all those same fiscal effects, I'd say look at it as a whole. There are winners and losers here, but I think it's made the world a better place. I'm a little bit less willing to tell the 70% of the country that never went to college that you're going to pay extra costs and higher prices, higher interest rates, and higher taxes in the future to help law graduates. But, if someone wants to make that argument, go ahead. Ultimately, in all four of these examples that I gave you, what the types of people doing analysis, like everyone in this room, can do is really use a technocratic approach, use the annoying cost benefit, use the annoying budget constraint, use the annoying indirect effects, all the things that economists revel in, to speak on behalf of all of the people who are affected by a policy. Policymakers usually hear from the people that are directly affected. They hear from the lobbyists for the people that want the student loan relief, or the lobbyists for Intel, or the lobbyists for the solar industry, whatever it is. They don't hear from people whose mortgage rates are going to be higher, who are going to suffer from higher inflation, people in the future, the consumers that benefit from the companies, whatever it is. And technocratic analysis, I think, can actually be truly democratic and can give voice to people that otherwise are voiceless in the policy process. Now, I do think analysis needs to keep improving. This is an incomplete list, but it's not just GDP and growth, but it's welfare more broadly. And I think the OECD has been a real leader on that and understanding the many dimensions that welfare takes. But if your income goes up by a factor of 10, pretty much every measure of welfare goes up by a factor of 10 too. Well, not a factor of 10, goes up as well. But within the advanced economies, when you've reached a certain income, I think growth is very good, but there's a lot of other things that matter. Handling, closely related, handling multiple goals and acknowledging trade-offs and analyzing trade-offs between them. One thing that I think economists, and my guess is you might be more villains than heroes on this one, Alvaro, but I don't know if I'm being unfair, need to do a better job of conveying our uncertainty. Our forecasts go wrong all the time, even though, they're presented almost as point estimates. We don't know the underlying model of the world. Things constantly surprise us. And part of why that matters is two things. One is sort of, if you are always predicting everything's 33% chance of this, 33% chance of that, 33% chance of that, you'll be less embarrassed than if you predict things are 100, 0. It doesn't feel as good the day you're making the forecast, but in retrospect, it's a little bit better. But also you need to do policy making not based on one model of the world, and your policy works if that model is correct. You need to do policy making under 5 different models of the world. What if this is true? How would my policy work? What if the second model is true? How would my policy work? What if the third one? And then do something like max min, the best possible outcome in the worst possible case, or average across them, or do something else to integrate. And as I said before, that's where some of my affection for policies that get you to the 85th percentile under a wide range of economic theories, to me, beats a policy that under one view of the world gets you to 100th percentile, but under a different view of the world gets you to a 40th percentile. That feels more fragile. So I would conclude by saying, I think economists still have a lot of prestige. We still have really amazing tools. We're still listened to quite a lot. We have our faults, and we do need to keep improving. Some of that is through modesty. Some of that is through openness to ideas. But I think we shouldn't be too ashamed and should really explain to people just how flexible and open-minded economics is in one sense, but how constraining it is about thinking about trade-offs, thinking about budget constraints. But finally, that thinking about trade-offs and budget constraints isn't about getting in the way of things to help people, but it's precisely about making sure there aren't unintended consequences that could end up hurting the people that you wanted to help, but instead give you and help you craft solutions that really do truly help the broadest number of people. That's the end of my rant, and now happy to discuss that or any more mundane topics on your minds.
Thanks very much, Jason. So we'll open the floor. Obviously, I think you're absolutely right when you wrap up. I think some of the criticism of to economists is due, and I think it's warranted. But in many ways, I think economics also evolved in the last 20 or 30 years. That many people who were saying that we were not listening did not understand what was happening in economics, right? With trying to experiment with different methodologies, being open to more different type of policy advice and so on. I think economics as a discipline evolved a lot more than it was given credit for, I think. Anyway, but questions to Jason? Please raise your arm.
And introduce yourself to me.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you very much, Gerhard Jandl. I'm the Austrian ambassador here to the OECD. Thanks for the excellent presentation.
Ambassador from
Austria.
Oh, okay.
And well, my question relates to what you have been saying on economists being listened to or not being listened to by politicians. Only recently we had the governor of the Austrian Central Bank, Mr. Holzmann, who had also been a professor in the States in his earlier life, but more earlier than that, he had also been working for the OECD, as you had been in your previous life. And he said back then, like 30 years ago, all the recommendations and the reports and the economic surveys and everything were much more sort of clean and clear, speaking the mind of what the economists really thought. And nowadays the language has become very diplomatic and very much, you know, not so direct, etc., etc. And he was complaining about that, you know, back then the economists, you guys, were basically saying what you thought, and now you're only saying what the diplomats like you to be said. Now, a question to you, Professor, also against the background of your role as working for the administration. In the administration, is a recommendation or an economic survey by, say, the OECD more taken into consideration, more taken serious if the language is clear and direct and forthcoming and demanding, or is it more impactful if the language is softer and more diplomatic? I know that I'm talking against my own profession because, you know, for us diplomats, it's much more easier and much better if the language of any text is soft on the countries rather than harsh, but nevertheless, this would be my question. Thanks.
Yeah, so first of all, I don't know what documents were like 30 years ago. It is the case that everyone always thinks everything was better 30 years ago. And this may be an example of that bias, or it may be correct. I wouldn't be surprised if it was correct. I do think some of what Alvaro and I were talking about, that economics itself has become a little bit more nuanced and pluralistic, makes it a little bit less clear what the policy recommendation is in every situation. I can tell you that when I was representing the United States here, I wanted to see the OECD err on the side of clean, crisp recommendations, even if they went against the United States. And my view is, if there were 10 clean, crisp things, 7 of them we'd agree with, 3 of them we wouldn't, and on 2 of the 3 it probably was because the OECD was right and we were wrong, and on 1 of them it's because the OECD was wrong and we were right. And that was better than just sort of having it all go to mush. The State Department often had a different attitude. They were like, fighting every word and every report, and why don't you stand up to this and stand up to that? And and my view is, I thought the world was a little bit better with more frankness, and no offense to all of you, it wasn't like just because the OECD wrote something, the United States did it the next day. I thought we could survive. So that's sort of my own view. In terms of the United States, honestly, the OECD Economic Survey and the IMF's Article 4, I think, have less influence in the United States than they do in any other country in the world. We just don't care that much. It's not written up in the newspapers. It doesn't become a political focal point. I would read it. I would get something out of it. But yeah, I'm not sure there's any way to write it that would sort of overcome the fact that anyway, a whole set of things, a whole set of reasons for that. In general, yeah, I mean, obviously, I think like an op-ed I write in the newspaper is sort of clearer, more forceful, more direct, and more obvious what I'm arguing for than like the average thing produced by, a group of people here. Some of that's probably unavoidable, but yes, I think waking up and saying greater clarity, even if that's at the expense of annoying someone here or there, is sort of a better rule. It's easy for me to say, it's easy for you to say, but I think it's a good idea.
course, we have a lot less. You have a lot of think tanks in the United States, and I think that's one of the reasons.
Yeah, yes. Part of it is we don't need it as much. We do have better analytic capabilities, so I think it's not just insularity. Although there's a bit of insularity.
I have a question for you, more related to.
Do you have a name also?
Yes, sorry. Okay. Cristiana Vitale from the Economics Department. You talked about, well, we've moved away from being big is bad in antitrust, and we have much more nuanced analysis. But when it comes to tech companies, now issues have become very complicated. They probably have become big for good reasons, but will they ever be challenged again? As you know, the economics around it is quite complicated, and many countries have decided that probably antitrust policy is not enough and you need more than that. But the US is one of the few countries where there has been a lot of debate behind the scenes, but nothing has ever got to the stage where it was at least discussed by policymakers. What do you think is that?
Yeah, so I chaired an expert panel for the UK government that developed a recommendation that they've turned into legislation and set up a digital markets unit, and it was ex-ante pro-competitive regulations that aren't that different from what you'd have under competition policy, but spelled out in advance rather than done after the fact through the litigation process. Part of why I did that project was for the frequent flyer miles, which was the only compensation I got for it. And the other reason I did that project was I thought it would be an example and a role model for the United States. And in that second respect, it was an example and a role model for like a report that some group of policymakers in the United States, policy people in the United States wrote, but it didn't go much further than that. For a variety of reasons, change is much slower on every topic in the United States. And on this one, I think that's a problem because the companies are in the United States. It makes much more sense for the US to be doing this than the UK, Europe, and everyone else. And it makes sense to have a basically converged approach to it. I don't think you can have a single regulator, but if everyone's doing the same thing, you can do one thing and comply with all of them rather than have to figure out each separate jurisdiction. But I do agree that you have to be very careful with the regulation because of what was in your premise. This is the most complicated area because these companies are big for good reasons. Scale is great. They were super good at what they did. They make these amazing products. And they stay big in bad ways to some degree. That's what the court found with Google and its monopolization. And they became big not just through organic growth, but also through mergers like Meta combining Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram. And so sorting out, keeping all the good stuff, getting rid of the bad stuff, putting a thumb on the scale of competition, I think we definitely need to move in that direction. But you do need to be careful in how you move in that direction, but not careful to the point of paralysis, which is roughly where we are in the United States. Although, I guess the big caveat to that is obviously we have these legal cases and we don't know what will come out of them.
We have a few people here, but online, if you have a question, raise your virtual hand. Don't forget, okay?
Thank you. I'm Carl. I work in the financial economics team of the Financial Affairs Directorate. I had a question on climate transition. So I think in France, there's been a pretty sort of frank public debate about the extent to which climate transition will be inflationary that I haven't seen as much in other countries. And so I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on how, if at all, inflationary moving away from fossil fuels will be, and sort of what policies you would have in mind to address that.
Yeah, I guess I have a somewhat old-fashioned for medium and long-term view and belief in the classical dichotomy that inflation is a monetary phenomenon and everything else is a real phenomenon. I think in that sense, the climate transition could raise the neutral or equilibrium real interest rate because you're increasing investment demand. By the way, AI and data centers and the like are also another factor pushing in that same direction. And so I think of the climate transition not as being inflationary, but as putting upward pressure on real interest rates. And maybe that's precisely why it isn't inflationary. I guess if you were a central banker and somehow misunderstood all of that and kept erroneously real interest rates too low based on some historical view of what neutral is, then it could be inflationary. But I don't think central bankers set interest rates very much based on a theory of neutral. They set it by looking at this inflation going up or down, is it away from our target or not? And then you back out neutral and infer what it is. from what they did. So yes, I think the climate transition is an important part of the analysis of demand, but not inflation. And you know, we went through a huge investment boom, more in the United States than other countries, in telecom and the internet, and we didn't think of that as inflationary. We thought again of that as driving up interest rates, and some of the productivity that came from that we thought of, at least in the short run, as you made a transition to it, it was a productivity surprise, was deflationary. So I think all these structural theories of deflation, of inflation, you know, another one is deglobalization. You know, that'll be inflationary. I don't think that's correct. I think globalization is about relative prices of tradables and non-tradables, not about the price level. And you know, Canada is a much more globalized country than the United States is, but it's not like inflation dynamics or the slope of the Phillips curve or anything like that is any different in Canada than it is in the United States. Once you have a floating exchange rate, the price that things come in from China, again, the relative price is not absolute. So I'm less big on there's going to be structural challenges pushing up or down inflation. Central banks can do what they want, but there will be structural things on real rates.
Thank you. I'm Hayden Ward-Elbaris. I work on the design of the global minimum tax. But my question is about a paper that Natasha Sarin, who's at Yale, wrote recently about a broken budgeting process. And part of her thesis, at least, is that there's an asymmetry in the way you do budget scoring, whereby when you do a kind of a tax cut, you do take into account dynamic effects, whereas a lot of spending policies, like a child tax credit, don't take into account the presumed future growth that will come from that. So I guess the question was just to reflect on the budget scoring process and whether or not you see there being asymmetries and how that plays out in the policies you get.
Yeah, Natasha's a close friend, and I've talked to her about that paper a lot. I guess I'm convinced that better analysis is better. I'm less convinced than she is that everything that's left out sort of helps Republicans and hurts Democrats. And in particular, one thing Democrats tend to like more than Republicans is more redistribution, more progressive taxes, transfers. I think an awful lot of those do have some cost to growth and some benefit measured in some welfare sense, like, you know, utility goes up, you know, or whatever your social welfare function is. And I think in some sense, the budgeting process has let Democrats do more redistribution without penalizing them for it and taking into account the negative consequences for growth. So I think there's some things that progressive like that are good for growth, and that gets omitted from the process. I think there's other things that are bad for growth that gets omitted. And so I see this less as a bias sort of towards either direction in the political process and more as something that it would be better to get right. And by the way, her Yale Budget Lab, I think, is doing a terrific job on all of this.
One question. So,
And a name.
Hold on, Falilu. You have Jacob online, and then we go to you. Okay, Jacob.
Thank you very much, Jacobo Garcia from the Directorate for Public Governance. Thank you, Mr. Furman, also an alumni of the Kennedy School. I wanted to ask, there are some discussions in specific countries about the role of central banks and whether the objective should be beyond controlling inflation and also promoting growth, like in the US. But others claim that the traditional approach of just having the objective of controlling inflation is better. What would be your advice on this issue? Thank you.
Great. So I don't think it matters a lot whether you have a dual mandate of price stability and employment. I think if you add anything beyond those two, then it does matter, and it matters in a bad way. So the US versus the ECB, we have an unemployment mandate, but how do we define unemployment? We're not trying to get the unemployment rate to zero. We're trying to get to the unemployment rate to what is consistent with stable inflation. How do we judge where we want the unemployment rate to go? By looking at the inflation. And if inflation is high or rising, then we want unemployment rate down. We want unemployment rate up, and vice versa. We want it down. So in some sense, unemployment really is another way of restating inflation in the US model targeting. Conversely, in Europe, you can think of it the opposite way. Europe's trying to target inflation, but if it sees an unemployment rate of 10%, European central bankers are going to say, you know what, we're not that worried about inflation next year. Let's lower interest rates. Conversely, in the rather unlikely scenario that Europe sees an unemployment rate of 2%, I think policymakers would say, you know what, we're really worried we're going to have inflation next year. Let's raise interest rates. So I don't think there's a big difference between whether you include an explicit employment target or not. When you start adding other things like growth, I think actually is a bit of an issue because a lot of that is structural. Climate change is, I think, something that is not central to price stability or employment stability in the short run. It's not something that I think central banks have great tools for. And it's something that, this is especially true in the United States, but to some degree it's true everywhere, there's not a societal consensus on. And so when you're trying to hold on to your independence and you only have one tool, let's not have 3 goals with one tool and have one of those goals be one that not everyone agrees on. So I think adding additional things outside of that is dangerous and worrisome.
Thank you. Fadi Lufal from the Economics Department. So I just about this, the role of economists and experts and how clear we should be. I'm simply, should we always, as economists, go for the first best and advocate for the first best solution? What I mean there is, we all know the political economy around reforms and the difficulties there, and sometimes we go for the second best or third best. An illustration is when we go for economists, most of the economists, classical, say, okay, having a carbon price there is good, but in France, it gives the yellow jacket.
Right.
We go for increasing retirement age, but in all Europe, you know, you have protests around it and populism. So when we see the difficulties with the first best, so sometimes we say, okay, maybe what is feasible is the second or the third best. Is that the lack of clarity? We're saying, oh, are we betraying our role if we do that? And in your role at the, Council of Economic Advisors, where we know also the difficulties of political economy reform in the US, what will your, pick and choice? Thank you.
Yeah, so I spent a decade in the White House, 8 years under Obama, 3 years under Clinton, so I guess more than a decade. And I would say I developed a very, very high level and comfort and tolerance with going as high as the 13th best. But I drew the line there, and if it was 14th best, I'd throw a fit. I think there's 2 bad ways to do economic advising. One is to only see the first best. And, if we were having a meeting on whether or not to do some regulation on microwave efficiency, and some economist came into the room and said, what would be even better than a regulation on microwave efficiency would be a carbon tax. Everyone else in the room would be like, but, we're doing this regulation. The law said we had to do this regulation. We can't pass a carbon tax. What's your thoughts on the microwave regulation, that it's not as good as a carbon tax? That's not useful. That's not helpful. One economist I knew in government, every time he saw a new idea, he said it was the worst idea he had ever seen. And he said this about 7 ideas in a row. I said to him, well, it is theoretically possible that each one of these ideas was even worse than the last. That's sort of improbable. So maybe these actually aren't all the worst idea you've ever seen. And let's start talking about whether they're 12th best or 14th best, because the all-important line is drawn at 13. So that's a bad way to be. There's another bad way to be, which is to be the economist who walks into the microwave meeting and says, wow, this is the single best policy ever. This is the #1 thing you can do about climate change. Carbon taxes, they're an outdated idea. They don't really work. No one would pay attention to them or buy a new microwave because of them. This is great. And that's a problem too, because you never quite know when you're going to have the opportunity to do what. And so I think the role of economists as economists is to say, here's, the first option and it's 10 out of 10. The second option is 8 out of 10. The third option is 3 out of 10. The next one is minus 6 out of 10. And then have that as an input into the policy process. And the mistake is if you only tell people about 10 and get really grumpy about everything else, or if you tell people the number 3 is number 10, and then political people can help sort through that. Now, some economists are in a position where they're not in that division of labor. If you're a finance minister, I don't think you can quite afford to just list the options and not have some call where you're trying to make a judgment about issues like the yellow vests and the like. But I don't think everyone needs to be making that judgment. I think it's important for some people actually not to be doing that, but to be giving the menu of options. And the last thing I could say is the two least powerful people in a political process are the person who never gets their way and never has their advice listened to, and the person who always gets their say and always has their advice listened to. The first is quite obvious why they're not powerful. The second, if you're an economic advisor and the president is doing what you say on every single thing, that's because you figured out what the president wanted to do and you gave him a reason to do it and you made him happy with the decision that he was already going to make. You had no power whatsoever. You just had a good ability to predict and suck up to where things were going. I'm not sure what the right batting average is. My guess is like 75% of my advice was taken and 65% of that was because I was in sync and thought about things the same way as the president. And 10% was because he changed his mind and did something different because of what I said. But I'm not really sure, but I definitely wasn't at 0 or 100.
If we take this one, if there's no one online, then we'll wrap it up.
Hey, hello, Jason. So my name is Paul. I work in the Bulgaria, Morocco, China desk in the economics department. And I just wanted to ask, having followed the...
I won't know the answer.
No, I just wanted to ask, having followed the U.S. election a bit, there was a lot of economic ideas or economic discourse that, from an economist perspective, doesn't seem so sensible. And I'm just wondering, what your thoughts are about kind of the transmission of economic ideas or transmission of economic policies to the public, if you're happy with it, and what we can do to improve upon that.
Yeah, so I wrote a Wall Street Journal op-ed that began with, this is the first election in American history where two economics majors are running against each other. Both Harris and Donald Trump majored in economics in college, and that economists aren't thrilled with what they're hearing. I then said you need to do gradations of thrill and magnitudes of thrill, and that I thought there was a difference in magnitude. Look, they're different things. Harris emphasized housing supply, for example, and the importance of building and reducing zoning obstacles to building. I think that idea really did come from economists and policymakers researched by people like Ed Glazer, my colleague at Harvard, and that's sort of why she did it and why she talked about it. That didn't show up in a lot of her television advertisements. So in some sense, in a presidential campaign, a speech is cheap talk. If you like an idea, you can put it there. But if you want to spend 100 million or $1 billion sharing that idea with people in a 30-second version, then you do the things that the people want to hear and want to vote for you in favor of. That's sort of less cheap talk. Showing up in more of those ads was her price gouging proposal. Now, one version of the price gouging proposal was in extreme emergencies. You can't charge people $100 a bottle for water. I don't particularly mind that. But certainly the ads made it sound an awful lot like when you go to the grocery store tomorrow, there'll be some like policemen from the federal government forcing them to take their current profit margin of 1.4% and somehow make it even lower. So your things can be, 0.2% cheaper. And, that's an idea, needless to say, I didn't think was a good one. I said that publicly. So they're maximizing something different than what we're trying to maximize. And to some degree, I'm not going to go out there and say, hey, just because I think it's a bad policy, it's a bad idea to do it to maximize votes. I'll just say, if you happen to get elected and you actually do follow through on this, you're more likely to make people worse off than better off. And trade is an example of people just have a really, really hard time thinking about comparative advantage. They think very asymmetrically about trade and technology, even though in some respects the two are quite similar. And in the United States in particular, while I wouldn't recommend it as a public policy, like we wouldn't be like horribly off as an autarky. We wouldn't starve to death. We could probably even make cars. We'd have like big microchips, and eventually we'd have small microchips, which is, not true in like Bulgaria. Bulgaria, the idea of autarky, my guess is like doesn't go quite as far as it does in the United States. See, I knew something about Bulgaria, at least I guessed.
All right, so with that, I just want to thank, so let's give Jason a big round of applause. So we restarted this Chief Economist talk, I think, in the best way. We're lucky that this week, in fact, we have a second one with Ricardo Reyes on Friday, and he's going to talk about how do people update expectations during an inflation spurt. So it'll be interesting, especially for us that we are preparing the economic outlook. But look forward to seeing you next time around. And again, thank you very much for being here or online, and wish you a great day. Thank you.